So there are two types of fiscal policy, discretionary and non-discretionary. Fiscal policy is using T and G to stabilize the macroeconomy. Okay? That's the major fiscal policy overview in a nutshell. Now, here's one thing I want to point out. Because the use of fiscal policy to stabilize the economy is actually very intuitive. For now, I want you to keep in the back of your mind the budget balance. Okay? And let's think about this logically. Okay? The tools of fiscal policy are G and T. Let's pretend we're going through inflation. So let's say the scenario we have is inflation. The tools of fiscal policy are G and T. We're going through inflation. What should the government be doing in terms of spending if we're going through inflation? In which direction should this G be moving if we're going through inflation? Should the government be spending more when we're going through inflation? Or should the government be spending less when we're going through inflation? So think about that. Inflation increases in the price level, the general price level. Think of it as too much money chasing too few goods. What should be happening to G? Yeah, the government should be spending less. What about taxes? During inflationary times, too much money chasing too few goods. What should the government be doing with taxes? Think of it as if there's too much money, how can the government get that money out of the economy if they want to fix inflation? Yeah, raise up the taxes. During inflationary times, you could have an increase in taxes. That's the appropriate discretionary fiscal policy. Lower government spending, or both. The point is, during inflationary times, you're going to see taxes go up, government spending go down, if fiscal policy is moving in the right direction. This actually leads to, think about it, what's happening with the budget balance? If taxes are going up, government spending is going down. What's happening with the budget balance? Yeah, it's moving into a surplus. So during inflationary times, the budget balance will move into surplus. What if we had the recession scenario? Now we're going through a recession. If we're going through a recession, a downturn in economic activity, what should the government be doing in terms of spending? Yeah, trying to help us increase the G. There's nothing wrong with a stimulus when we have economic activity stop because of a deadly virus called COVID-19. There's nothing wrong with the government increasing unemployment insurance and payments when we're going through the Great Recession because the financial system crashed in 2008. So during recessionary periods, the appropriate fiscal policy is an increase in G. What should they be doing with taxes during during recessionary times? You want people to have more money in their hands. So taxes should be going down. If the government is spending more and taxes are dropping, what's happening to the budget balance? Yeah, it's going into deficit. So during recessionary times, if we see a deficit, it's not alarming because that's what fiscal policy says is appropriate. Okay? During inflationary times and we see the budget balance moving into surplus, that's not alarming because that's what fiscal policy says is appropriate. So identify the tools, two types, discretionary and non-discretionary, and have an understanding of how these variables move to fix either inflation or a recession. Alright, so what I want to go through is, I want to go through a bit of a numerical example for you to see how fiscal policy really works. And what I'm going to start with firstly is what's called expansionary fiscal policy. And as the name suggests, with expansionary fiscal policy, we're trying to expand the economy. Now, when would it be appropriate for us to make the economy bigger? What type of macroeconomic instability would we be trying to fix? It's a recession. So the federal government engages in expansionary fiscal policy during recessionary times. It's to fix a recession. Now remember the tools of fiscal policy. It's government spending and taxes. So if we're trying to expand the economy or to fix a recession, then what makes sense is for an increase in G, increase in government spending. Think of it this way. We're going through one of the worst crises we have ever seen, COVID-19 in 2020. We have the economy stopping because of the national shutdowns. Nothing is moving. Production has stopped. Work has stopped. Consumption has stopped. GDP has come to a halt. What should the government do? Well, a stimulus makes sense during periods of this type of instability. Increase in spending for unemployment compensation makes sense during these instabilities. Think of 2008 when we went through the Great Recession, when we had the financial system collapse. What made sense then in terms of fiscal policy? And if you think about it in a very logical way, the reaction to a recession is an increase in government spending if we're going to engage in expansionary fiscal policy. What about taxes? During a recession, we want people to have more money. If we have the economy at a standstill, then we want more consumption, we want more movement. So a decrease in taxes will mean an increase in disposable income. So during recessionary periods, the federal government will engage in expansionary fiscal policy. This is increasing G, lowering T, or doing both. And if you think of the budget balance, if taxes, i.e., revenue for the government is going down, and they're simultaneously spending more, we're pushing the budget balance into a deficit. So seeing a deficit during recessionary periods is not alarming. In fact, it's indicative of expansionary fiscal policy moving in the right direction. Now let's look at this with numbers. Let's take a look at this economy. Now, let's say the full employment level is 510 billion. Do you see that? Now, let's say this economy is going through a recession, which means they are below their full employment level. In fact, to be very specific, they are at 490 billion instead of the 510 billion, which means they have a recessionary gap, a shortfall from full employment of 20 billion. We want to use expansionary fiscal policy to fix this recessionary gap by getting the economy back at the full employment level. So let's look at those numbers. The recessionary gap is 20 billion, okay? And in that economy that we just looked at, we're going to argue that the MPC is 0.75. If you're forgetting what the MPC is, this is the marginal propensity to consume. The MPC, marginal propensity to consume. For every extra dollar that's given in this economy, only 75 cents of it is consumed. And we want to engage in fiscal policy. That's what we're going to do. Now let's take case number 1. Okay? Remember the tools of fiscal policy. It's G and T. And let's take case number 1 where we increase G, government spending. Now let me ask you a question. We want to fix this gap of 20 billion. We want to increase aggregate demand by 20 billion. And we know we need to increase G. We're going to get it up. The federal government is going to go in and increase G. If our aim is to fix a recessionary gap of 20 billion, do we need to increase G by exactly 20 billion? Do we need to increase G by less than 20 billion? Or do we need to increase G by more than 20 billion? Which one is it? We know we gotta get G up, but by how much? It should be less than the 20 billion. And if you're wondering why less than the 20 billion, because of something called, yes, the multiplier. So something called the multiplier. Anybody remembers the formula for the multiplier? Remember, the multiplier is saying when we change the components of GDP, it will be magnified or multiplied so that by the time it settles, the equilibrium GDP would have increased by more than the initial change. So if we need 20 billion, that's where we need things to settle. We need to increase G by less than 20 billion because the multiplier is going to hit it. The question, or where we are right now, is we're trying to figure out how do we calculate the multiplier. If you remember, the formula was 1 divided by the MPS. Now, in the scenario I gave you earlier, I gave you the MPC. Here I'm saying the multiplier is 1 divided by MPS. Anybody remember the relationship between MPS and MPC? Well, if the MPC is 0.75, the MPS is 0.25, which means the multiplier in this example is 4. Now we're going somewhere. We need to increase G by 20 billion. Any increase in G is going to be multiplied 4 times. So we want to close a gap of 20 billion. The increase in G is going to get hit 4 times. By how much do we need to increase G? 20 billion is going to get hit 4 times. Yes, 5 billion. If you increase G by 5 billion, it's going to get hit by the multiplier 4 times. It will close the 20 billion. Those were G and T. We need to decrease T. Now, the T is a little bit tricky. Because if you remember, I want you to look down here for a minute. Help me. GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Remember this? The G is sitting in the GDP equation. It gets hit by the multiplier. There's no T in the GDP equation. So when we decrease T, how does it fix the recessionary gap? How does it change equilibrium GDP and shift aggregate demand? Now think about it. If you pay less taxes, if you decrease taxes, what happens? Yeah, you get more pay. Your income increases. And when your income increases, then what? Yeah, you consume more. So, the taxes work through C, because the C is going to get hit by the multiplier. So if we think about this, the C also gets hit by the multiplier. So any increase in C is going to get hit by the multiplier. The only issue is to get people to increase C, we got to give them more money. And when we give them more money, they then consume more. Now here's my question for you. In this economy, when we give people an extra dollar, do they consume all of the dollar, less than the dollar, or more than the dollar? Less. The MPC is 0.75, which means for every dollar we give people, only 75 cents of it will be consumed. So every time there's a tax cut and you get a dollar more on your pay, only 75 cents of it will go into consumption. So let's rewind. We need to close a recessionary gap of 20 billion. We know we gotta get people to consume more. We know we have to get people to consume a very specific amount more because the multiplier is 4. So we know we gotta get people to consume 5 billion more. Why? Well, 4 times the 5 will close the gap. The only problem is to get them to consume 5 billion more, we gotta give them more money in the form of a tax cut. We can't give them exactly 5 billion more because only 75% of it will go into consumption. Now, here's a little trick I use to help me remember this. Whenever I'm trying to figure out the tax cut piece, because I know we're going to have to give them more than the 5 billion, more than the amount of consumption. What I use to help me remember is I remember keep the C's consistent. Well, how much more? This is what I remember. I always remember take how much I need to consume it by and divide it by the MPC. So C divided by MPC. Okay? That's why I have 5 divided by 0.75. And this is going to give you for a tax cut. If you punch this in your calculator, you're going to get 6.67 billion. That's what you need to do for the tax cut. And think of it this way. You give a tax cut of 6.67 billion, 75% of it will go into consumption. Because remember the MPC is 0.75. That's exactly 5 billion. Once consumption goes up by 5 billion, the multiplier hits it, it closes the gap. So to summarize, okay, you want to engage in expansionary fiscal policy? Well, if you want to engage in expansionary fiscal policy, that's to fix a recession. So you increase the G, and the G is very straightforward. The multiplier is going to hit it. In this case, the multiplier is 4. Or you decrease the T. The decrease in T is a little bit more tricky because it's going to change income. You need income to go up by more than what you need for the increase in C. And if you ever forget, just remember, keep the C's consistent. C divided by MPC, and that's what gives us the tax cut of 6.67 billion. Okay? Go back here. Here it is, operationalized. The full employment level was 510. We are below it at 490. We have a recessionary gap of 20 billion. What do? Well, we increase G by 5 billion. That's the 5 billion increase in spending. It gets multiplied 4 times. It will close the gap. Or you drop taxes by 6.67 billion. Income will go up by 6.67 billion. But we're only going to consume 5 billion of that. And again, the multiplier hits the C and we close the gap. Okay? That's the multiplier effect for the recessionary gap.